Nolan Wells was only 18 when his life ended. He was a college football player, a son, and a young man who still had weeks to go before his 19th birthday. The night before he disappeared, he was at home making dinner for his family. He didn't own a car, so getting anywhere usually meant when his friends came to get him. That was normal for Nolan. On July 4th, he went out with those same friends to spend the holiday on Horn Island. Nothing about that decision was supposed to become the beginning of a tragedy. He was 18, he was with people he knew, and he expected to come back home. He never did. 6 weeks have now passed, and Nolan's parents are still waiting for a clear explanation of what happened to their son. The state completed its autopsy days after his body was recovered. The examination was done. The report exists. But the family still does not have the definitive answer they were hoping for. So they sought another examination themselves. And the conclusion they received was devastating in its uncertainty. Undetermined, not a confirmed accident, not a confirmed homicide, not an explanation. Undetermined, and that leaves Nolan's family with a question they've been asking from the beginning. How did their son die? That question has also become buried underneath a growing battle over the story surrounding Nolan's final day. People have formed conclusions. Accusations have spread. Different versions of the timeline have emerged. But I'm not going to pretend that I know what happened on Horn Island when the available evidence does not allow us to say that yet. What we can do is separate what has actually been established from what remains unproven. Because 6 weeks after Nolan's death, some of the most important questions are still sitting there. And now, for the first time, the 3 young men who were with Nolan that day have spoken at length about what they say happened. They sat down with attorneys and answered questions about their friendship with Nolan, the trip to the island, the moment they left, and what happened afterward. Their account is important, but an account is still an account. So we're going to listen carefully to what they said, and then compare those statements with the timeline and the evidence that has been made public. Because there is one claim from that interview that could dramatically change how we understand the final hours of Nolan Wells. And it has nothing to do with speculation on social media. It comes down to a specific time, a specific location, and 2 people who allegedly saw Nolan alive after his friends had already left the island. If that claim can be independently supported, it matters. If it cannot, that matters too. So before we decide what happened to Nolan Wells, let's hear directly from the people who were there. And as you listen, keep one question in mind. What can actually be proven? Because sometimes the most important part of an interview isn't what someone says. It's what the evidence can or cannot confirm afterward.
You know, obviously, before this happened, I would assume you're living a regular life, young guys being in college, having a typical experience, then you lose your friend.
I think, ever since it happened, my life just, hit like a hole. Even going out, we're always paranoid somebody's gonna see us, get spotted, try to beat us up potentially, or even worse.
You just met these young men more recently. And are you confident that these young men had nothing to do with it? We have Ed Pausick, Warren, Jax, and then we have Morgan here. And so I talked to Warren last time I was here. We had a really deep conversation, and I'm glad that we were able to get other perspectives now that we have Ed here. Ed is a defamation attorney. And I want to start with you, Ed. Why did you choose to work with the boys? What is your plans? What do you expect to get out of working with them? What's your expectations when it comes to defamation?
Well, I think an injustice in one place is an injustice everywhere. I hate lying. I care about the truth, but most of all, it's the actual people who are involved here. So first of all, I just want to say Tyler Cox really welcomed me here, my co-counsel. He's an incredible human being and he's an incredible attorney. And then after that, I had an opportunity to meet these incredible young men. And I just got to say, these guys are unbelievable. Warren, Jackson, Morgan, they're just beautiful people. They're really decent human beings. They're just great people. And that's why I'm here, because I want to help great people. And this is a very sad situation, but it's also a very human situation. And it's a tragedy.
So you guys have, obviously before this happened, I would assume you're living a regular life, young guys being in college, having a typical experience. Then you lose your friend, Nolan. And after that, what has life been like for you guys?
I think like ever since it happened, my life just like hit like a hole, like it just stopped. And I mean, we just gotta live day by day from now on. I could say definitely a whole flip upside down for our lives. It's like even going out, we're always paranoid somebody's gonna see us, get spotted, try to beat us up potentially, or even worse. We're really just trying to stay low key and not go out as much or anything like that. Yeah.
It's been hard because my friends and I are people. I mean, we like to be out and hang out outside of our friend group, and not being able to like go certain places or, walk around in public because our head's always on a swivel. It's really affected all of us. I mean, especially in like my family's standpoint, my safety comes first. My friends and family safety come first too, and it's been really hard because I'm worried about like my family as well with me, and it's hard. But we're just going day by day and just trying to get through every day.
Can you give me some examples of what has happened? Have you guys had things happen online, threats online? Have you guys have any examples of people accosting you or anything like that?
Oh yeah, we have had countless death threats online, been spotted. I'll let you elaborate more on that, being spotted.
I mean, people have obviously just pointed us out. I mean, as a group and even on a one-on-one setting, I think it's really just like awkward because I don't want to talk about this, and I know my friends don't want to talk about this any more than we need to. We're still mourning one of our best friends' death, and it's hard to speak about it when, like sometimes we just need some alone time, or sometimes we just need to, lay back and not be around all this. And I mean, I've been called out in public, and I haven't been in public that much. I know my friends have had encounters in public. The threats have been insane from, my stepmom and my dad, my mom, just everyone included, like even my brothers and my sisters. And it's just hard. I mean, it's unbelievable where like this has been taken to and the level where this is at.
When you say you've been called out in public, can you give me an example of like, what do you mean? People are threatening you with weapons? People are, not allowing you, denying you service? Because I heard that Trayston, he went to a corner store and they told him his money is not good there. They wouldn't even let him buy Gatorade.
Yeah.
Are you experiencing things like that or something totally different?
Right. I wouldn't say like that. I think I haven't been denied, anything, but like Trayston, it's hard to hear from a good friend of mine that he's getting denied a Gatorade and a Red Bull before work and having to, like, he calls me, he's like, dude, you won't believe what just happened. He got called out at Walmart. Someone called him out at Walmart and was like asking him all these questions and trying to press him about it. And it's crazy to me. Like, we live in a very tight knit community, and for people to, push back and say these things when they know what Ocean Springs is like, it's really hard. And I mean, I haven't had many personal encounters, but I know being around the guys and stuff like that, they have, so.
And Ed, as an attorney that's representing these boys, I mean, what does that make you feel like? Do you feel like you got a good case here, or what's your perspective in that? Because people are online, and obviously they know who you are. Obviously they know you represented Donald Trump in some pretty high-profile cases, and so now that you've joined, or at least now you work for the young men here. You hear them say things like they've been accosted, they've been, threatened online. Does that make your case a greater case, or how do you work within what's happening to these young men?
Well, unfortunately, I wish there was no case. I wish this hadn't happened. But unfortunately, because these things did happen, there is a case, and now there's multiple cases. And I'm gonna tell you something. If you're out there and you lied about these guys, you lied about my guys, you lied about Tyler's guys here, if you lied about Morgan, if you lied about Jax, if you lied about Warren, we're gonna get you. And you're gonna be hauled into court, you're gonna be held accountable, and it's gonna be very painful. And what I would say to the people who have done that is, now's your chance. If you want to apologize and retract before you find yourself in court, you should probably do that now. Because if you don't do that, once you're in court, now you just can't leave. You won't be able to get out of it. And we're not going to name names because there's some other folks who are doing that, and we want to be better than that. And I want to emphasize this, right? We're not here to guess. We're not here to speculate. We're only going to deal in facts, right? And here's the most important thing, right? We don't know how Nolan Wells died. No one here is saying we know. But what we do know is Morgan, Jax, and Warren had nothing whatsoever to do with Nolan Wells' death. And that's what's important. And unfortunately, because there are people who want to divide a town and come in from the outside and tell people what to think and pit neighbor against neighbor, it compounds the tragedy. It magnifies the tragedy. And I just want to say this. Here's why it's an even bigger tragedy. Because my friends here, Morgan, Jax, and Warren, these guys are not just the finest that Ocean Springs has to offer, finest that Mississippi has to offer. These are the finest young men that America has to offer. These are, really great people. And Tyler actually taught me good Ocean Springs people. That was one of the first things I heard when I got here. So I'll just say that. They're good Ocean Springs people.
Sorry to interrupt. I know you're enjoying this incredible interview. Make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and also join our membership program. Let's get back to the interview. And how confident are you? Because you just met these young men more recently. And are you confident that these young men had nothing to do with it?
Confidence not a strong enough word. In fact, beyond a reasonable doubt is not strong enough. There's a 0% chance that they did anything wrong. So this is not 90%, it's not 99%, it's not 99.9999. There's no decimals, there's no anything. It's 100%, 100.000%, nothing. They did nothing wrong, and that's the problem for our opponents here, who have ruined their lives, dragged them through the mud, and attack them. You don't get to lie. We have a First Amendment. We love our First Amendment, but you don't get to lie and hurt people. You want to lie and it doesn't hurt people? Fine. You lie and you hurt people, that's why we have defamation. And that's what this is about. So I just want to emphasize this in the strongest possible terms. Zero wrongdoing. Completely innocent, totally innocent, and categorically innocent.
And you guys have had experiences with either people threatening you online. I know that, Warren, we talked about this before, and we talked a little, or at least spoke a little bit about when you go out, you guys are getting accosted by people. Can you give us an example of, or at least tell the audience an example of an incident where you guys may have been accosted? Or what does that look like when you go out? People threaten you with weapons, or people trying to physically harm you, or people having to be restrained? What kind of engagement is happening when you guys go out?
We went to a restaurant, a couple of buddies of mine, and when we were, I wouldn't say threatening with weapons or anything, but I felt, and I know my friends felt, threat for our lives. I mean, I don't think there was like a fear factor, but at the same time, like it's awkward in public, like I stated, like when we have to talk about these things. But we went to a restaurant and someone came up to me and was like, "Is this you?" And I was kind of like shaken up about it. Well, at first she asked like my name and like all these questions, and I was like, okay, whatever, she's just coming up to talk. Well, then she came up to me again and showed me our first interview and was like, "Are you sure this isn't you?" And I was like, "Well, yeah, that's me, like obviously." And she kind of just, I looked at my buddy and I was like, "Yeah, we're leaving, like close everything out, like we're going." And I left, and there was an altercation after I left with some of my buddies that weren't involved in this at all. and they told my friends that they were going to kill them and they wanted to fight and all this like crazy stuff. I mean, I wasn't there, but my friends told me this, that what the people were saying to them was like totally just crazy. Like, I mean, there was people like that were, you know, outside of this telling us like, hey, you need to leave before something happens, because I know what could go down right now, and like I know that these people are crazy. So I mean, we all felt, we were kind of shaken up about that. It was weird because it was our first encounter as a group, and I think it's also like just crazy that people will like look at you in the eye and tell you they'll kill you because they believe you killed your best friend and you have nothing to do with it.
And Morgan and Jax, were you guys there?
Yes, we were there.
I was there.
I didn't hear the part where they said they were going to kill him and stuff, but I did hear whenever she came up to him originally, she was like, hey, you have like TikTok or anything like that? Your face looks really familiar. And he was like, no, I don't have TikTok or anything like that. And she was like, oh, okay. And then walked off, and then came back with, like you said, the first interview on her phone, and showing him. She's like, so this isn't you. Either you have a doppelganger or this is you. And he was like, well, yeah, that's me. And then we got the check, and we bounced, and we were waiting outside for everybody else to get out of there. And while we're waiting outside is whenever some of our other buddies that aren't even on social media that we were just there with was getting told that other people were going to kill them and all that kind of stuff.
So how did that make you guys feel did you think they were serious? Did you think it was just people trying to make a name for themselves by confronting you in front of others? Like, what was your take on that, Morgan?
I think it was just like, I was in the general area of where one of our buddies was, where this altercation happened. And I actually got into a conversation with a fellow next to me that wasn't even involved. And he told me straight up, he was like, if I was y'all right now, I would leave before y'all get hurt. Y'all need to leave right now. I'm just watching out for y'all and making sure y'all are safe. And I mean, I wouldn't say that those people would have physically done something in that moment, but I think they were playing like almost like a mental game, like just to get into your head and just almost like make yourself like just think these things that obviously are not true.
If you can go back to the very beginning of this, how do you think this should have played out? Because I always question in my mind that when I go back, I look at what happened, I look at the initial stories with Nolan, and you guys knew him, right? I didn't know him. I know none of you guys. I just had a chance to meet you guys more recently. But how do you think this should have gone? If you could control the environment, Nolan is found deceased. How do you guys think that this should have been put out to the world?
So first off, I wish that none of this would ever happen. I wish Nolan could still be here with us today. And I wish that, like I said, none of this would ever happen. Like, I wish that all this could be erased and Nolan could be here tomorrow. I mean, that's more than anything. But other than that, I feel like his mom blasting us on social media from the get-go, saying that he was out there with Warren and another guy. That's where it first started to take off. And then also the fact that she posted a picture of me and Morgan and another guy and Nolan on the boat together, blasting that out there, pushing this narrative, kind of, I guess. I wish that would have never happened either. And I don't think those would have never happened, a lot of this stuff wouldn't have been as viral or gone all over the country at this point. I mean, this is a countrywide news story that is just blown out of proportion. And the fact that it was our best friend and it's not what people are saying it is what hurts the most. I mean, that was our brother. I mean, straight up. That's what I told his dad the night that he came over to my house. He was like, blah, blah, saying something. I was like, dude, that was my brother. Like, and you know that. He knows that. We were picking him up every single day. He never drove. I can't tell you how many times I pulled up in his driveway and picked him up. And it wasn't him asking, it was just because that's what we did. We just picked up Nolan all the time. That's how we, came about to all the stuff that we were going to. We'd go and pick him up. That's how much we like to be around him. We would do stuff like that all the time,
Well, first off, I wish we would have never, I think about this every day. I wish we would have never went out on the 4th of July, because I know this wouldn't have happened. Nolan wouldn't be gone. And it's really hard to think about, because it's like, I wish I would have done this different, or I wish I would have done that different, because now one of my brothers wouldn't have passed away. But I think from the beginning, I'm glad that I called the Coast Guard, and I'm glad that we came together as a group, even from the first day when people started texting us things, saying, crazy things. But I wish it wouldn't have been reported as some type of race thing. I think it's really bad that people are pushing the narrative of, oh, this is a race thing. Well, obviously it's not. I mean, this is like a brother to us. I mean, Nolan's no different than anyone else in our group. And I just wish this wasn't pushed on the media as, oh, this is a bunch of white guys that killed a black guy, or this is in the beginning it was like 4 guys went to a stranded island and dumped Nolan at the island and just left him there. Even from the beginning, it was just like this thing, and no one had facts, and they were just pushing this horrible narrative, all lies about everyone, and it's sick. So I wish that would have been completely different. I'm glad I called the Coast Guard. I'm glad I made the first contact within all of this. I'm glad I was the first one that called Christine Wells that night and told her that we haven't heard from her son. And I'm glad that I did all of that, but I hate the way this has been perceived by the media and portrayed. This has been absolutely horrible with the way and the things that they've said to us and done. But other than that, I mean, there's not much I would change from my point of view and my friend's point of view. I think we did everything right, and I know we did nothing wrong.
I also want to say, I think it's so criminal that they took something so anti-racist and flipped it into something super racist. This is the definition of anti-racism. I mean, that we did not look at Nolan any different than I looked at him, or even you. This is literally our brother. I mean, like we stated, we did not treat him any different. We didn't treat Trayson any different. We don't treat Trayson any different. And they just flipped it. And I just think that is so wild that they're pushing this thing that they're saying, oh, they want to end racism and all this stuff. Well, they're the one pushing it. They're pushing the racism. And I just think that's kind of crazy.
Morgan, what's your thoughts on this? How does it affect you?
First I want to say, wish this would have never happened. I wish Nolan would still be here with us today. And, but in my opinion, I think that the media, they shouldn't have pushed a narrative from so early. I think that they should have let the local officials do their job, let them release statements, and then, the media is obviously going to see that and then do whatever they do. But that's what I trust the local officials.
Ed, with what has transpired, how does that dictate your response? Because you have a 30,000 foot view of all of this stuff, right? You see the way that it could have went, and you see that there's people that instigated the narrative that's out there now. And as a defamation attorney, how does this navigate your tactics?
Sure. And I want to be clear about something. Tonight, I'm not going to give any particular person any more oxygen than they may have already sucked up. But I will say this. What's been said about Morgan, Jax, and Warren, I'm not going to call them untruths or half-truths or falsehoods. I'm going to call it what it is, lies. So the first thing that's really important here is we're dealing with lies and liars. We're dealing with profiteers. We're dealing with hustlers. And one thing that I've seen since I got here is that Ocean Springs, Mississippi, is a really beautiful place. And the region is very beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful places in the country. And there is just no question, the death of Nolan Wells is a horrendous tragedy. But for the tragedy to then be magnified after his death for no reason other than profit is a disgrace, or what we would call a shanda. And I had the opportunity to go to Horn Island today with Tyler and Warren and Jax. And a lot of people who have been sucking up way more oxygen than they're entitled to have not been to the island. I'm willing to bet that a lot of the hustlers and profiteers and liars have not been to that island. And you have to go to that island. And being at the island today was revelatory. It was really illuminating. It's a very dynamic marine environment, first of all. But when you go to the island, you see instantly that what some people want to be true, what they wish to be true, they're trying to wish it to be true. They're trying to make it true through their lies. It's actually not possible. It is a very, very long and narrow barrier island. It's basically very low sand dunes. And in the particular part of the island that we're dealing with, there are no trees. It's hardly any foliage, hardly any tree cover, hardly any plants, and it's wide open. And on July 4th, there were thousands of people there. There is no possible way that anybody could have committed a murder in broad daylight on a barren, windswept island that is narrow and was just swamped with people that day in broad daylight. It's just not possible given the natural environment there. And that leads me to the next point, which is this. Once you know what the timeline is, when you combine the timeline with the actual dynamics of the island itself, all of the lies completely unravel because it isn't possible, and here's why. Morgan, Warren, and Jax left the island at about 4:30 p.m. That's it. They were gone. That is not open for debate. So that's a fact. They were gone. And at that time, Nolan Wells was still alive. Now, I'm not going to name them out of respect for their privacy, but just as one example, there are two very fine, upstanding members of the Ocean Springs community who saw Nolan Wells at about 10 minutes to 6 p.m. So about an hour and a half after these fine young men had left the island, they were gone, departed. Nolan Wells was alive. And these two witnesses, two very reliable, very credible, and very upstanding members of the community, they saw Nolan. And they've known Nolan for years. There's no chance that they made a mistake. And by the way, this can be corroborated through other evidence, other eyewitness accounts. And that's the end of it right there. And that's before we get into everything else about the situation.
And when I look at this, I feel like there's levels of defamation and areas of defamation. And I'm not going to speak on your behalf because this is y'all's story to tell, your story to litigate. But which areas are the most egregious that you are going to go after, or that you guys think also are areas where people have taken this situation and clearly lied to the public? One being the phone call. What is your thoughts on that phone call to Cito? Some people have gone out and done enhancements to the audio, and in doing that, created a transcript manually. It doesn't appear that the transcript was derived from an automated system or have any, in my opinion, real integrity with it. What are your thoughts first, you guys, on the audio, and then I'll get to you, Ed, on could that be a defamatory area the way it was produced. So what do you guys think about that audio?
Nolan Wells was 18 years old when he went to Horn Island with people he considered his friends. It was the 4th of July, the kind of holiday that should have ended with an 18-year-old coming home tired, sunburned, and ready to tell his family about the day. Instead, Nolan never came home. 6 weeks later, his parents still did not have a clear answer about how their son died. The state had completed an autopsy, but the findings had not been publicly released. A private examination commissioned by the family returned an undetermined cause and manner of death and, according to material released about that examination, did not rule out the possibility of foul play. Then, on August 10th, 3 young men who had been with Nolan on that island finally sat down together in front of cameras. They denied involvement. They explained their version of what happened. And their attorneys introduced a claim that, if independently established, could completely change the timeline of the investigation. 2 people, they said, saw Nolan alive at approximately 5:50 that evening, roughly 90 minutes after the boat carrying his friends had left the island. That sounds like a straightforward piece of information, but it creates a much bigger question. Who were those people? Because their identities were not released. Their statements were not made public. Any evidence said to support their account was described, but not shown. That does not mean the witnesses do not exist. It does not mean the claim is false. It means the public has not yet been given enough information to independently evaluate it. And that distinction matters enormously in a case where the central question is not simply who was on the island, but what happened during the hours between Nolan being left behind and his body being found in the water 2 days later. To understand why the August 10th interview matters, we have to go back to the afternoon of July 4th. Nolan had gone out to Horn Island with friends to celebrate Independence Day. The island sits roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, and on a holiday like the 4th of July, it can become crowded with people arriving by boat. Nolan was not driving himself. According to the accounts described in the source material, that was normal for him. His friends frequently picked him up because he did not drive. That detail might sound insignificant. It isn't, because when the boat later developed a problem, the question of how Nolan would get home became part of the story. At some point that afternoon, the boat began taking on water. The bilge pump reportedly failed, and the group decided that they needed to return to the mainland. The 3 young men who were on the boat, later, said Nolan chose to remain on the island. Their account was that he planned to get a ride back with another group. The boat left at approximately 4:30 p.m. That time has become one of the most important fixed points in the investigation. 3 young men were heading away from Horn Island. Nolan Wells remained behind. And somewhere between that moment and the discovery of his body 2 days later is the part of the story nobody has been able to publicly reconstruct with certainty. Nolan was reported missing that night. Search efforts followed. Then, on July 6, a park ranger found a body in the water near the northwestern portion of Horn Island. It was Nolan. The discovery answered one question that his family had been desperate to answer. Where was their son? But it created another question that remains at the center of the case. How did he die? The initial public discussion included the possibility of accidental drowning, but the later forensic developments made the situation considerably less straightforward. The family's private examination returned an undetermined cause and manner of death. There were also questions surrounding an area of discoloration reportedly observed on the back of Nolan's head. Those details have fueled enormous speculation online. But speculation is not the same thing as evidence. That is important because this case has generated competing narratives from almost every direction. Some people have focused on the 3 young men who were with Nolan. Others have focused on the circumstances surrounding the boat. Others have questioned the medical findings. And some have made much more serious accusations that have not been established publicly. The August 10th interview was therefore significant because, for the first time, all 3 young men appeared together and spoke at length about the case. Warren Hudson, Jax Patello, and Morgan Seymour sat beside attorneys and gave their account of the events. Their position was clear. They denied involvement in Nolan's death, but the interview did something else. It put their stories under a much brighter spotlight. And when several people describe the same sequence of events, the important question is not simply whether they sound convincing. It is whether their accounts fit together. That is where the story begins to become more complicated. One of the attorneys representing the young men, Edward Paltzik, focused heavily on the timeline. His argument was straightforward. If the boat left Horn Island at approximately 4:30, and if two credible people saw Nolan alive at approximately 5:50, then Nolan was still alive long after the three young men had left. If that account is independently confirmed, it would place a significant amount of distance between the young men and whatever ultimately happened to Nolan. And that is why the 5:50 sighting matters so much. It is not merely another witness statement. It potentially changes the entire timeline. But there is a major limitation. The two witnesses were not publicly identified. According to the attorney, they were people from the Ocean Springs community who had known Nolan for years and would have been able to recognize him. He described them as credible and said their account could be corroborated, but the public has not been shown their statements. There is no publicly released affidavit from either witness in the material we're examining here. There is no public recording of the two people describing what they allegedly saw, and the supporting evidence mentioned by the attorney has not been fully detailed. That leaves us in an unusual position. The claim could be extremely important. It could also already be known to investigators. But from the outside, we cannot yet determine exactly what investigators have in their files. And there is another reason the timeline deserves attention. In the first days after Nolan disappeared, the sheriff's office publicly appealed for information from people who had been on Horn Island. Investigators asked for photographs and video from the area, including material that might show Nolan or possible altercations. That tells us something important about the investigation. It shows that authorities were looking broadly at what may have happened on the island. It does not prove that an altercation occurred. It does not prove that Nolan was killed. And it certainly does not establish who may have been responsible. But it does mean that eyewitness information from the island was potentially important from the beginning. So if two people really did see Nolan alive at 5:50, their account could be one of the most important pieces of information in the entire investigation. The question is when they came forward. If they spoke to investigators immediately, that would be one situation. Their statements could already be part of the investigative file, and the August 10th interview may simply have brought a previously private piece of evidence into public discussion. But if they did not come forward until much later, that raises a different set of questions. Why? Where exactly were they standing? What exactly did they see? How long did they see Nolan? Did they speak to him? Who else was nearby? How did they know the time? And who did they tell? Those questions are not accusations. They are the basic questions investigators would have to answer about any eyewitness account that could potentially reshape the timeline of a death investigation. And there is something else we have to be careful about. The existence of a witness does not automatically establish that the witness is correct. A person can be sincere and still be mistaken. A person can remember a time incorrectly. A person can identify someone correctly but misunderstand what they were seeing. That is why corroboration matters. And that is exactly what makes the attorney's statement so important. He did not merely say that two people saw Nolan. He said their account could be corroborated. If that corroborating evidence exists, then eventually it should give investigators something concrete to work with. And that could be anything from additional eyewitnesses to photographs, video, phone records, location data, or another independent piece of evidence that places Nolan on the island at that time. Until those details become available, however, the 5:50 sighting remains a claim that needs to be examined rather than a fact we should simply accept. And this is where the three friends become central to the story again, because before August 10th, there had already been public discussion about their accounts. Warren Hudson had previously spoken publicly about what happened. He denied having anything to do with Nolan's death, and also denied involvement in alleged tampering with Nolan's phone. He said Nolan had been encouraged to leave the island with the group, but chose to stay. Then, weeks later, all three young men appeared together. That is significant because when people who were together during a critical period eventually tell their stories publicly, viewers naturally begin comparing the details. What stayed the same? What changed? What did one person remember that another did not? And were those differences meaningful contradictions? Or simply differences in how three people remembered a chaotic day? Those are very different questions, and we should not answer them simply, because one version makes for a better headline, The real test is whether the accounts can be compared against independent evidence. That is where this investigation has to go next, because the story is no longer only about three friends saying they had nothing to do with Nolan's death. It is about a timeline. A boat that left at approximately 4:30. An 18-year-old who remained behind. A reported sighting at approximately 5:50. A body recovered 2 days later. An autopsy whose public findings remain limited. And three young men who have now placed their own version of those hours on the record. The question is no longer simply what they say happened. The question is whether the evidence outside their statement supports it. And that is where the August 10th interview may become much more important than the interview itself. The claim about 5:50 changes the timeline. But before accepting what that claim means, there is another part of the story that has to be examined. What did the three young men say happened after they arrived at Horn Island? Because their account has remained the foundation of their defense from the beginning. According to Warren Hudson, Jax Patello, and Morgan Seymour, Nolan was with them on the island that 4th of July. They spent the day together, and at some point the boat began taking on water. The bilge pump was not working properly. The group decided they needed to leave, but Nolan did not leave with them. That is the moment where the entire case begins to separate into two different timelines. In the first timeline, the three friends leave at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, while Nolan remains behind because he intends to return later with another group. In the second timeline, something happens to Nolan after that departure. The problem is that nobody has publicly established exactly what happened during those missing hours. And that is why the 5:50 sighting is so important. Edward Paltzik, the attorney now representing the three young men, said two people who had known Nolan for years saw him alive at approximately 10 minutes before 6 o'clock. That would place Nolan alive roughly an hour and a half after the boat carrying his friends had left. If the witnesses are accurate, the timeline becomes extremely significant. The three young men would already have been gone. Nolan would still have been alive, and whatever eventually led to his death would have happened later. But that statement immediately creates another question. What exactly did those witnesses see? Paltzik described them as credible members of the Ocean Springs community. He said they knew Nolan. He said there was no possibility they had mistaken him for someone else. And he said their account could be corroborated by additional evidence and other witnesses. Those are strong statements, but they are still statements. The names of the witnesses were not released during the interview. The public was not shown their statements. We were not given a detailed description of where they were standing, how long they observed Nolan, or exactly what Nolan was doing when they saw him. That does not mean the witnesses are unreliable. It simply means the public does not yet have enough information to independently evaluate their account. And that distinction becomes even more important because investigators had already been asking people who were on Horn Island that afternoon to come forward. The sheriff's office asked for photographs and video from the island. Investigators wanted information from people who may have seen Nolan. They were also interested in possible altercations or disturbances. So if these two witnesses existed at the time, their information could potentially have been important from the earliest days of the investigation. If they came forward immediately, their statements may already be part of the investigative record. If they came forward later, investigators would have to establish why their memories remained undisclosed for so long. Those are two very different circumstances, and neither can be assumed without evidence. There is another part of the timeline that deserves attention. The three young men have repeatedly said Nolan chose to remain on the island. That detail matters because it changes the meaning of their departure. If Nolan was abandoned against his will, that would raise one set of questions. If Nolan voluntarily decided to stay because he expected another ride back to the mainland, that would raise another. The young men say it was a second situation. They say Nolan had friends on the island and expected to return later. They also point to something that had apparently become routine between them. Nolan did not drive. His friends frequently picked him up. According to their account, it was so normal that nobody considered it unusual. They would go to Nolan's house, pick him up, and continue with whatever plans they had. That history is important because it provides context for why Nolan could have been comfortable relying on friends for transportation. But it still does not answer the central question. Why did he remain on Horn Island that afternoon? And who was he expecting to take him back? That is a kind of detail that could potentially be established through phone records, messages, photographs, or testimony from the people who were supposed to be part of that plan. If another group was actually expected to give Nolan a ride, identifying those people could be extremely important. They could potentially tell investigators whether Nolan contacted them, whether he planned to meet them, whether they actually saw him, and whether they remember anything unusual about his behavior that afternoon. Again, these are not accusations. They are simply the questions that naturally follow the timeline the three young men have provided. And then there is the island itself. Horn Island is a long, narrow barrier island surrounded by water. On the 4th of July, it was crowded. Thousands of people were reportedly in the area. Paltzik later visited the island with Warren and Jax and emphasized how exposed the terrain is. There are stretches with little vegetation and limited places to hide. His argument was that a violent attack in broad daylight would have been extremely difficult to carry out without someone seeing something. That is a reasonable question to consider. But geography alone cannot solve a death investigation. An open beach might make certain scenarios less likely. It does not tell us whether Nolan entered the water voluntarily. It does not tell us whether he suffered some kind of medical event. It does not tell us whether he was injured. And it does not tell us whether something happened somewhere else before his body was recovered. The geography can help investigators test the timeline. It cannot replace the forensic evidence. And that brings us back to the part of the case that remains unresolved. Nolan's death. The state completed its autopsy, but the public has not received a definitive explanation of the cause and manner of death. The family's private examination also reportedly returned an undetermined result. That means the medical evidence has not publicly established a simple answer. And when the cause of death remains undetermined, every timeline becomes more important, because investigators are not simply trying to determine who was with Nolan. They have to determine what happened to his body, how he entered the water, whether he suffered an injury, whether there was a medical explanation, whether substances played a role, and whether the physical evidence is consistent with an accident or something else. One detail that has received particular attention is the discoloration reported on the back of Nolan's head. That detail has led to questions about whether he suffered some type of trauma. But a discoloration by itself does not establish what caused it. That requires forensic interpretation. The location, appearance, condition of the tissue, other injuries, toxicology, and circumstances surrounding the recovery all have to be considered together. And that is why it is dangerous to take one physical finding and turn it into a conclusion. The same caution applies to the absence of obvious injuries. If investigators initially found no clear external signs of trauma, that does not automatically establish an accidental drowning. Some causes of death leave obvious injuries. Others do not. And some circumstances can make determining the exact cause extremely difficult. The answer has to come from the complete forensic examination. That is also why the family frustration is understandable. They are not simply asking who was responsible. They are asking how their son died. Those are different questions. And so far, the public information has not resolved either one. Meanwhile, the three young men have been trying to explain their own actions. During the interview, they described the experience of losing Nolan as devastating. They talked about him as a close friend. They described him as someone they considered a brother. And they repeatedly said they wished the 4th of July had never happened because, if it had not, Nolan would still be alive. Those statements are emotionally powerful. But the investigation cannot be decided by emotion from either side. Nolan's parents can be completely devastated and still not know exactly what happened. The three young men can genuinely love Nolan and still have to answer questions about the timeline. Both things can be true. That is why the focus has to remain on evidence. And one piece of evidence mentioned during the interview but not fully explained was Nolan's phone. There had been discussion surrounding a phone call and audio connected to the case. The young men were asked about the recording and about claims that people had enhanced the audio or produced their own transcripts. That is another area where caution becomes essential. Audio can be misheard. Background noise can make words difficult to distinguish. Enhancement software can make an unclear recording easier to hear, but it can also create misleading interpretations when people begin treating an uncertain sound as a confirmed word. A transcript created by someone watching a recording is not automatically an official transcript, and a person's interpretation of an audio recording is not the same as forensic authentication. So if the phone evidence becomes important to the investigation, the original recording matters, the original device matters, the metadata matters, the chain of custody matters, and investigators need to determine what was actually said rather than what someone believes they heard. That is especially important because a phone can potentially establish much more than a conversation. It can establish timing. Location information may exist. Call records may exist. Messages may exist. Photographs may contain timestamps. Even deleted information may sometimes leave traces that investigators can recover. That kind of evidence could potentially strengthen or weaken different versions of the timeline. And this is where the investigation reaches a critical point. The three young men say they left at approximately 4:30. Their attorney says two witnesses saw Nolan alive at approximately 5:50. If those 2 points are independently established, there is a clear gap. Nolan was alive. His friends were gone. Something happened afterward. But what? That is the question nobody has answered. And there is another question hidden inside it. Who else was on Horn Island during that period? The 4th of July crowd matters. Because if thousands of people were present, there may have been people who saw Nolan without realizing that they were seeing him for the last time. Someone may have taken a photograph. Someone may have spoken with him. Someone may have noticed him walking alone. Someone may have seen him near the water. Someone may have seen another person with him. And someone may have witnessed something that seemed completely ordinary at the time. That is why investigators ask the public for photographs and video. The smallest detail can sometimes become the missing piece in a timeline. But there is still a larger issue. The three young men are not the only people whose accounts need to be tested. Everyone's account needs to be tested. The witnesses described by Paltzik need to be tested. The timeline needs to be tested. The boat's departure needs to be tested. Nolan's expected ride back needs to be tested. The phone evidence needs to be tested. And most importantly, the physical evidence needs to be tested against all of those stories. Because if the forensic evidence contradicts the timeline has a problem. If the forensic evidence supports it, that matters too. And if the forensic evidence remains inconclusive, investigators will have to rely much more heavily on the surrounding evidence to reconstruct what happened. That is why the state autopsy remains such an important unanswered piece of this case. The three young men have now publicly given their version. Their attorney has provided a potentially significant eyewitness claim. But the medical evidence is still the piece that could tell us what happened to Nolan after those final known hours. And until that evidence is fully understood, no one should pretend that the case has already been solved. Because there's a difference between knowing where three people say they were and knowing what happened to the person they left behind. Nolan Wells was alive when his friends say they left him. According to the new account, he was still alive roughly 90 minutes later. 2 days after that, he was dead. Somewhere between those points is the answer, and the investigation now has to determine exactly where that answer begins. And that is where this investigation stands. Not at the end, not with a definitive answer, but at a point where two different versions of the final hours of Nolan Wells are now sitting beside each other, and the evidence has to determine which parts of each version can be supported. The first version is the one the three young men have given. They went to Horn Island with Nolan on July 4th. The boat developed a problem. They decided to leave. Nolan chose to remain on the island because he expected to get a ride back with another group. The three young men left at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. And according to their account, Nolan was alive when they left. The second important piece comes from Edward Paltzik. He says two members of the Ocean Springs community saw Nolan alive at approximately 5:50 that evening. If those witnesses are established and their account is corroborated, then Nolan remained alive for roughly another hour and a half after his friends had departed. That would be significant. But there is still a gap between knowing Nolan was alive and knowing what happened next. And that gap is where this case remains unresolved. Because the question is not simply whether Nolan was alive at 5:50. The question is what happened between that sighting and the moment his body was recovered 2 days later. That is the part nobody has publicly reconstructed. And it is also the part where forensic evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Nolan's family has been waiting for an explanation of how their son died. The state completed its autopsy on July 7th, yet the publicly available information has not provided the family with the definitive answer they have been asking for. They eventually sought a private examination themselves. That examination reportedly returned an undetermined cause and manner of death. And that word matters. Undetermined does not mean murder. It does not mean drowning. It does not mean suicide. It does not mean accident. It means the available evidence did not allow the examiner to reach a definitive conclusion. That leaves the door open to several possibilities. And when several possibilities remain open, the investigation has to become more precise, not more speculative. The reported discoloration on the back of Nolan's head is one example. People have already attempted to interpret that detail. Some have treated it as evidence of an attack. But that conclusion cannot be reached simply by looking at a description of discoloration. A forensic examiner has to determine what the finding actually represents. Was it trauma? Was it related to the circumstances in which the body was recovered? Was it something that occurred after death? Was it related to the environment? Or was it something else entirely? Without the complete medical findings, none of those possibilities can responsibly be declared the answer. And that is why the autopsy is more important than any argument made during the interview. The interview can tell us what the people involved remember. The autopsy can tell us what the body revealed. Those are two different forms of evidence. Both matter, but neither should be allowed to replace the other. There is another reason the medical evidence matters. The three young men have built much of their public defense around the idea that they could not have been responsible because they were already gone. If the 4:30 departure is correct, and if Nolan was alive at 5:50, then the timeline strongly separates them from the later period. But even that does not automatically answer every question surrounding Nolan's death. It answers one question. Where were the three young men during that part of the timeline? It does not answer what happened to Nolan. That distinction is crucial. A timeline can exclude one possibility without identifying the correct alternative. If evidence establishes that someone was somewhere else when a death occurred, that may be extremely important. But investigators still have to determine who or what caused the death. And that is why the case cannot end with the 550 claim. It has to continue through the people who may have seen Nolan afterward. It has to continue through the people who were on the island. It has to continue through the phone evidence. And it has to continue through the medical examination. There is also the question of Nolan's expected ride home. The three young men said he intended to return with another group. That should be one of the easiest parts of the timeline to examine. Who was that group? Did Nolan contact them? Did they contact him? Were they actually on Horn Island? Did they see Nolan? Did they leave before or after the 550 sighting? And if they did not see him, why not? A simple transportation plan can become extremely important when someone disappears, because Nolan's decision to stay only makes sense if there was a realistic way for him to get back. That is one of the details that investigators can potentially verify through witnesses and communications. And if the evidence supports it, it strengthens the account given by his friends. If the evidence contradicts it, then investigators have another problem to examine. That is the way this case should be approached. One fact at a time, not by choosing a side first and then searching for evidence to support it. The same applies to the allegations surrounding Nolan's phone. The interview discussed an audio recording that has been interpreted by different people. Some people have reportedly enhanced the audio and created their own transcripts. But an independently produced transcript is not automatically an accurate representation of the recording. The original audio is what matters. And if the recording becomes relevant to the investigation, investigators can examine the original file, determine its source, establish whether it has been altered, and analyze exactly what can and cannot be heard. That is a much stronger process than listening to an edited version and deciding what the words must be. The same principle applies to every piece of digital evidence. A screenshot is not the same as the original message. A reposted photograph is not necessarily the original file. A person's interpretation of a recording is not the same as forensic analysis. And a timeline created by someone online is not the same as a timeline established by investigators. This case has become complicated partly because so many different versions of events have appeared. The three young men have their version. Nolan's family has their concerns. Attorneys have presented their arguments. Witnesses may have information that has not been publicly released. And investigators have evidence that the public may not have seen. Those pieces do not necessarily contradict one another, but they have to be assembled carefully. There is also an important human element that should not get lost. Nolan was not a headline. He was 18 years old. He was preparing to turn 19. He played football at Southwest Mississippi Community College. He had a family. He cooked dinner for them the night before he died. He depended on friends for transportation because he did not drive. And according to the people who knew him, those friendships were important to him. That is why the phrase, best friends turn against each other, carries so much weight. Because at the center of this story is a friendship that is now being examined under circumstances none of these young men could have imagined. The three friends say Nolan was like a brother. They say they loved him. They say they had nothing to do with his death. And they say they have been forced to defend themselves while still grieving him. But Nolan's family is living with a different reality. Their son went out with friends. He never came home. His body was found 2 days later. And weeks later, they still do not have the definitive explanation they want. Those two realities should not be turned into a competition. The investigation has to accommodate both. The young men deserve the presumption that they are not responsible unless evidence establishes otherwise. Nolan's family deserves a serious investigation into how their son died. Those principles do not conflict. In fact, they require the same thing: evidence. And there is one part of the investigation where the evidence may eventually become especially important: the grand jury process. According to the information presented in the material surrounding the case, a grand jury date has been discussed. A grand jury does not mean someone has been found guilty. It does not mean the investigation has already established murder. It means prosecutors can present evidence to a group of citizens who determine whether there is sufficient basis for an indictment. That process can potentially bring additional information into focus. Witnesses may be questioned. Evidence may be presented. Investigators may be required to explain portions of the timeline. And depending on what evidence exists, the direction of the case could become clearer. But until that happens, there's a temptation to fill the unanswered spaces ourselves. That is exactly what should be avoided, because there is still too much we do not know. We do not know exactly what the two witnesses saw at 5:50. We do not know what corroborating evidence Paltzik was referring to. We do not know the complete findings of the state's autopsy. We do not know the full toxicology results. We do not know exactly what caused the discoloration reported on Nolan's head. We do not know precisely what happened during the final hours before his body was recovered. And we do not know whether investigators have already answered some of these questions privately while keeping the information out of public view. Those are not small gaps. They are the heart of the investigation. But there are also things we do know. We know Nolan went to Horn Island on July 4th. We know he was with the group. We know the boat left at approximately 4:30, according to the young men's account. We know Nolan did not leave with them. We know he was reported missing that night. We know his body was recovered from the water 2 days later. We know the cause and manner of death have not been publicly established as a definitive answer. And now we know that an attorney representing the three young men has introduced a potentially significant claim that Nolan was seen alive approximately 90 minutes after they left. That is the point where the investigation takes a turn, not because the case has been solved, but because the timeline has been challenged with a specific claim that can potentially be tested. If those witnesses are real, their accounts can be investigated. If their accounts are corroborated, the timeline becomes stronger. If additional evidence places Nolan alive at that time, that becomes even more significant. If the evidence contradicts the account, investigators will have to address that too. That is how this should work. Claims should not be accepted simply because they come from an attorney. They should not be rejected simply because people distrust the people making them. They should be tested. And the same standard has to apply to the accusations made against the three young men. If there's evidence that they were involved, that evidence should be examined. If there's evidence that they were not, that evidence should also be examined. Nobody benefits from replacing an unanswered question with an assumption, especially not Nolan's family. because an assumption cannot tell them how their son died. Only evidence can do that. And perhaps that is the most important lesson in this entire investigation. The loudest theory is not necessarily the correct one. The most confident person in the room is not necessarily the person with the answer. An undetermined cause of death does not mean there is no truth. It means the truth has not yet been established to the standard required to name it. For Nolan Wells, that answer matters. For his parents, it matters more than anything. And for the three young men who say they've been accused of something they did not do, the truth matters just as much. Because if they are telling the truth about leaving Nolan alive, the evidence should eventually show that. And if something in their account does not withstand scrutiny, that should also become clear. The investigation has reached the point where statements have to meet records. The 4:30 departure has to meet the evidence. The 5:50 sighting has to meet the evidence. The phone evidence has to meet the evidence. The island's geography has to meet the evidence. And above all, the medical findings have to meet the timeline. That is where the real answer is likely to emerge. Not from the most emotional accusation, not from the most convincing defense, but from the pieces of evidence that cannot simply change depending on who is telling the story. Nolan went to Horn Island expecting to come home. He never did. His friends say they left him alive. An attorney now says witnesses saw him alive after they were gone. His body was recovered 2 days later. And the medical evidence has yet to publicly provide the definitive explanation his family has been waiting for. So the investigation now comes down to a simple question. What happened to Nolan Wells between the last confirmed moment of his life and the moment he entered that water? Until that question is answered with evidence, the story is not over.